Hello friends, so today's video is going to be my November reading wrap-up. At the time that I'm filming this, it is technically still November, so there's a couple books that I'm hoping to still get around to that I haven't quite yet. One of them would be Gideon the Ninth. I started it. I liked the very beginning of it thus far, but I haven't been able to continue on just yet, and I don't know exactly when I'm going to be able to pick that one back up because if you saw my books I want to read by the end of the year, I'm hoping to get around to basically every fantasy nominee from the Goodreads Choice Awards. So I don't know when I'm going to pick up Gideon the Ninth again, but that is one I'm hoping to read. And then also The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. I have been meaning to pick this one back up, but again, same situation as Gideon the Ninth. So you might not see me talk about those for a little bit. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that I can really buckle down and get around to those ones also. But anyway, jumping to the ones that I did get around to. First up, we have Skyward and Starsight, as well as Read On and Sunreach, which would be the two novellas. Sunreach comes first and then Read On. So these two were a reread for me in preparation for Cytonic, which just recently came out. I will be doing a live show here on my channel on December 3rd. I'll have details for that in the description bar down below if you would like to join us. I'm very excited, but also because myself and then two of my friends, Jessie May and Jess Owens, recently interviewed Sanderson, so I kind of wanted to recap. We had a read-along going, so you could kind of read alongside us. But either way, I'll have that interview linked as well. But it was quite a good time. Many of you know for a long time I didn't want to do any author interviews. I didn't want to talk to authors at all. And I have done a video going over why I've slightly changed my mind. But one thing I made clear in that older video, I actually made it before interviewing Rosaria Munda, is that when I do have the opportunity to speak with an author, I really want to let you know that ahead of time so that when you hear my thoughts, I think it's only fair to admit that while I'm going to try to remain as unbiased as possible, I think from a consumer standpoint, it's only fair for you to know that I have that like potential extra, I want to like it more kind of a vibe. Either way, it was a reread, so I had read these before and my thoughts really didn't change. I still like Skyward more than Starsight. I still felt really similarly. So Skyward follows a girl named Spensa who is living on this planet that mankind has kind of been secluded to, and they are constantly attacked from the air by an alien species. They don't really know why the alien species doesn't seem to be putting forth more effort to extinguish them. They don't really understand why they just sometimes attack them, but regardless, they fight back, obviously, for the sake of mankind, and the Air Force is extremely important to the society because it's all that's really keeping them safe, and Spensa's father was a very well-known pilot who famously abandoned and then was shot down. So now Spensa's dreams of becoming a pilot herself has an extra obstacle because of the fact that her father's reputation has now left her with the reputation of being the daughter of a coward. She has a chip on her shoulder, she has something to prove, she thinks she's got life figured out, and she thinks that other people are just in her way, and I really love this character. I love their growth throughout the story. I love the friendship between herself and other characters. I really especially love the kind of, I'm not quite sure what to call this trope, but I'm going to call it the putting you in your place trope, or the now you realize you're not quite hot stuff kind of a trope. I always love when characters think they're hot stuff and then they're like, oh, wait a sec. Turns out this is actually really difficult. I always really enjoy that, and I think that Skyward captures that so well. There's also incredibly high stakes, and there's a mystery aspect to it, and there's a big reveal. The end is really exciting, and there's also kind of a animal companion to it, and then also a artificial intelligence companion aspect to the story, which I love. The second book dives into, I feel like, Sanderson's imagination. I mean, we get so much more opened up to us. And for me, the second one, the reason I don't love it as much as the first is because I miss the camaraderie of the first one. If you've been keeping up with my thoughts, you know that I have felt that way about Starsight. And like I said, I felt similarly rereading it. But one thing I think I picked up on a little bit more the second time around is why I didn't feel like I cared as much about the stakes. And it's because there's kind of this threat over here kind of a feeling. Perhaps a better way to put it is that the antagonist feels distant. The threat feels distant and you don't quite know what's going on, which is totally fine, except there would be moments where things were revealed to us, but I didn't have that connection or that hatred or that momentum to take down this other thing. And I don't always need it, but I think the moments in this book where we would get these, oh, but actually it turned out sort of things, I just wasn't as gripped by. Even already knowing and feeling like I had a heads up, I still was like, I want more of this. And also I did really enjoy the novellas. I wasn't really expecting to because I'm not a big novella person, and I've read some of Sanderson's novellas before for Stormlight Archive, and I also still didn't, absolutely love them, but I think I liked the Skyward novellas a little bit more than the Stormlight ones. They felt very necessary. I did a whole video talking about those ones, but to discuss what happens is a little bit spoilery. So the video I did is spoiler free, but it goes into a little bit more detail about them. I really enjoyed them. They focus a little bit more on some of the other characters. We get some of the action and the camaraderie from Skyward. We're just seeing it from other characters, which I enjoyed, and I liked getting the Skyward flight a little bit more. Since I just mentioned sequels, I'm going to stick to sequels and talk about the Bone Shard Emperor. So I don't know what everybody else is thinking about this book, and I don't care. I really liked it. I was so happy to be back in this world, and there are so many things that I'm like, I hope this happens, and then things would go the way I was hoping, and I was like, yay, and not in a predictable way, although some things I think are pretty obvious where certain things are going to go. I don't want to say too much about this second one because, of course, it is a sequel. So I'll mention a little bit about the first one and how this one contrasts to it. The first one, we have two main characters, Lynn and Jovis. Jovis I always describe as somebody who stumbles into being a hero. He doesn't want anything to do with the hero's life and having songs sung about him. He doesn't want that kind of a reputation. He does not want to be known. He just wants to find his missing wife, who has been missing for years and years and years. And I just think he's a really lovable character. He also has an animal companion that is adorable, which I love. And then the other character, their point of view, their story is so different because they are learning from their father, who is the emperor, about bone shard magic, or at least they're trying to learn, but they have so many memories missing. You understand that it's important for her if she's to take over when he passes away, and he even has another person ready to be his replacement in case she can't follow through. So you understand that, but you can tell there's more to it than just that, and you don't really know why. And he's very secretive and he's very mysterious, and there are these things called constructs that have to do with the magic system, which is a fascinating magic system, and the constructs essentially do his bidding. And then you do have a couple of side characters, some of which have some more political aspects going on, and then there is also this one other perspective that you're like, I don't know what is going on over here. This is really mysterious and strange. And so it made for a very interesting read, although for a while, I don't want to say it feels generic, because I don't think the first one ever really feels generic, but the things that make it special, I think, come in the second half. The things that make it a little bit of a genre bender and very unique come in the second half. But as a result, the second one, the thing I think that feels the least like the first, is that while there are still many things unanswered, and I still want to know so much more of what's going on and how things work, I think you feel less in the dark in this one, which means the almost horror sci-fi elements I don't think feel as prominent as they did in the first. I think this one's starting to feel a lot more like fantasy. You start to see more plot lines coming together, which I loved. I loved getting to see some of the characters come together. The animal companion aspect is especially present in this one, which was adorable. I flew through it. I think I read this in a day. I just sat down. I'm like, ooh, I've got my book now. And then I flew through it and I loved it. And I can't wait. I want the next one. I don't know what the author's plans are for the series as far as how many she's going to write, but I hope it's more than 3, because I don't know that I can have everything wrapped up in one more book. I think I want at least 2 more books. Anyway, I loved it. Sticking with adult fantasy, this one I'm not going to go too in detail because I did another video where I'm doing batch reviews for the Goodreads nominees and I just talked about it. But of course I want to give you a little bit of a heads up, and that would be The Wolf and the Woodsman. This is a story that I have seen marketed as a hate to love fantasy romance, but it is not really a romance. There is a romantic subplot. That is true. It is hate to love. That's true. But I really don't think the romance fantasy readers are going to find there's enough of that in this to get that itch scratched for them. And then for those of you who are like, I don't want anything to do with a fantasy romance, I don't think the romance is that big of a deal in the story. It's there, for sure, but it's not the main point. The main thing is we follow a girl from this pagan village, and she fears the Woodsman, these men that come and they take a seer from the village, a woman who has the ability to have visions. They will take one from time to time. Her own mother was taken. She's always feared them. She herself has no magical powers, but when the Woodsmen come again, the village decides, let's not actually give them our seer. Let's give them our main character and basically sacrifice her to the Woodsman, which is really sad. The Woodsmen take her and they're on their way to taking her to the king. You don't really know their purpose in taking these seers to the king. You just know that these women never come back and it's probably something awful and dangerous. And so our main character thinks that she's probably going to die, and she thinks that these people have such a violent, awful way about them, and they also think that about her. They call her Wolf Girl. And it's one of those stories where you see different worlds coming together and realizing that maybe it's a lot of, to put it very simply, a lot of just miscommunication and people not having all the information, and if only they would talk to each other. And they do. They get to know each other, and they're starting to realize that maybe they're not quite enemies the way they thought they were. And there are definitely a lot of things that create hostility between different groups in the story, and you explore that. But the thing that I think is going to make this very appealing to a lot of people is the folklore elements. It's not just inspired by European folklore, but I would say within the story, the characters have their own lore, which I loved getting to see. And what was always exceptionally fascinating to me was one character would be familiar with a certain story, and the other one would have a very similar story in their culture, and it would even involve similar beings, except for how the story was different is kind of speaking for how the cultures are different and how they view things. I do want to add, this story can be kind of violent and a little surprisingly brutal, and some of it involves self-harm, which sometimes came out of nowhere. Somebody would be like, if I harm myself in this way, I might get powers out of it. Maybe I should do that. And I'd be like, they're just thinking about it. And then they would do it. I'm like, okay, I guess we're just cutting off parts of ourselves now. Very briefly, I am going to mention Dune because I didn't get to mention this in my last wrap-up. I did do a whole dedicated vlog to Dune, and my husband gets to share his thoughts in that as well. So for me, Dune, I found that the writing style is definitely not my favorite, or the way in which Frank Herbert tells the story. I definitely preferred the adaptation. I thought the adaptation was a very true adaptation, but it's funny because I've seen some people feel that the book, you should read it before watching, and I almost feel like the movie makes reading the book easier because he gives you the information so bluntly, but we don't spend that much time with characters. So I hate to just throw out the phrase, show don't tell, but I guess that's the best way I can describe how I ended up feeling. It felt like I was told all this information, and of course some things are shown, but I didn't feel like I had the emotional attachment that I crave when I'm reading a story, but I'm such a character-driven reader, and I think this is much more about concepts and ideas. Either way, I think that you can very easily see how things talked about in Dune are true of our own world, and in some ways it feels like prophetic because you can apply it to things even in modern times, which I think is something that's very true of a lot of great sci-fi. I just really didn't care for the delivery. However, I probably will eventually, not anytime soon, but I probably will eventually pick up more books in this series. I can definitely see how it has influenced not just science fiction, but fantasy. Next up, we have Firekeepers Daughter. I have seen this. Some people seem to be under the impression that it is fantasy, and it's not. We follow a girl who is Native American, and it tackles a lot of the issues that we see when some kind of a crime is committed or when there is criminal activity involving people who are Native American in America. The very tense relationship that you see between the government, the FBI, and also Native Americans, and how some things go overlooked, or how when sometimes the government tries to get involved, they don't quite go about it the same way. The author tackles these things, I think, very well, and not just that aspect of the story, but so much of this character's heritage and culture. It is executed wonderfully. The main plot is that our main character, after something happens to someone she cares about, gets kind of pulled into an investigation involving some drug dealings in the area that she lives in. She is now tasked with becoming an informant, which is something she struggles with greatly, because while she wants to protect those in her community, she also has that tense relationship, knowing just a couple generations before the way that children were taken from their families. And there's just so many layers to this that I think this book explores. Despite all of that, I really wished that the story could have been adult, not that it objectively would have been better as adult. I think that it is suitable for teen readers, and I'm so glad that something like this exists for teens. It's just that I found some of the things that happened, I don't want to say it was unbelievable because they were so young. It's just all these teenagers, and teenagers couldn't do these things. It's not that, because I see that get thrown around about YA fantasy, and again, this isn't fantasy, but still, I know that gets said about young characters in books all the time. It's not so much that, it's that the book is broken up into parts, but in my mind, it was almost like there were three distinct parts. The beginning, where everything feels very contemporary YA. It's just this young teenage girl living her life. She feels very much like a real person, and her friend, they're both just kind of silly high schoolers. They're thinking about the future. They've got their own real life problems. And then part two is kind of after the inciting incident. After this terrible thing happens, then we get into the more serious investigative aspects of the book. And I really liked the juxtaposition between the innocence of this character and then being thrust into something so dark and having to confront that. I thought it was a great balance between the two. It also just made me feel so bad for this character, because the youthfulness of her, it's almost like it's taken away by something that happens sadly all the time. The last chunk of the book, the last third for me, was so many of the reveals were not as serious as what I personally felt like some of these topics called for. And to get into really important specifics, I do have to go into spoilers. So I'm going to have a timestamp. I do want to just read for a second here an example, but I have to set it up for all of you. So I'll have a timestamp you can skip ahead so that you aren't spoiled. But getting into the spoiler part, the character, there is a romantic aspect to the story that I kind of just wished wasn't there, because I think it took away time that we could have spent with some of the other important issues that get presented. But that's not really where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this is the main character is young. She's 18, 19 years old. And there's kind of a 21 Jump Street thing where this other character is pretending to be a high schooler, and that way they can get information trying to figure out things involving these drug dealings. So at one point, our main character and this character, who's also the romantic love interest, they get kidnapped. And they get kidnapped by other teenagers. And this is not the only example of this. I think in the last third of the book, we see other examples of this sort of thing, this kind of dialogue. But basically, one of the guys who's kidnapped them is just kind of talking smack. And he says to our main character, who they sometimes call Firekeeper's Daughter, he says, "Now I've got a story for you, Firekeeper's Daughter. Once upon a time, there was a smart princess who fell in love with the new guy in town, the prince that her brother encouraged to date his sister. She was presented with an opportunity to help her brother, a choice to make, to help or to not help. The choice they're talking about is dealing with the drugs. They want her to help them make drugs because she's really smart. So her brother is involved, and so they're like, oh, should you help your brother or not help your brother? That's the choice the princess is facing." That's what he's talking about here. So he says, a choice to make, to help or to not help, to save the prince, the other person who's been kidnapped, or be responsible for the tragic ending. Mike yawns while casually stretching his arms above his head. We'll be back tomorrow for your answer. For his sake, I hope you go with happily ever after. And even the dialogue tag, the part where it describes what he's doing, where he yawns and like puts his arms casually, it didn't feel like it matched the severity of the situation. It didn't feel like it matched the severity of a lot of what's tackled in the story. And I think that it's just because this is for a younger audience, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just my personal preference that if this had been adult, I think that maybe we wouldn't have seen some of the dialogue. Still, if you are interested in picking this up, highly recommend. I think we need more books like this. I hope we get more books like this. The last couple of books are back to fantasy. One of them would be Vespertine by Margaret Rogerson. This, as soon as I discovered that this book existed, I was excited for it. And I will absolutely need to reread this before. If there is going to be a sequel, I'm going to have to reread this before the sequel. There was just so much more to it than I was expecting. The main setup is that we follow a character who is a nun, and they are involved in helping keeping spirits from coming back and harming the living. And our character would much rather be around the dead than other people. And we'll get to that in just a second. But she ends up in trying to help others. She calls upon the spirit within a relic that then starts to constantly be in her head, and she's fearful that it's trying to sort of take over her body and then commit a lot of harm. She has to have this balance between holding it back, but then taking advantage of its powers to help other people. And there's sort of a mystery within the nunnery, I'll say. And it was super interesting and definitely a great fall Halloween type of read. But there's so much to the different spirits, and they do have some information to help you out in the back of the book. So they have all of that there, but it was so much that I just felt like I didn't take it all in. To the point, though, that I said I would get to in a second about the character who she's very antisocial. I saw a couple of reviews, and I don't normally want to ever make anyone feel like I'm dismissing their opinions, but I just want to, I guess, add a little bit of context. I've seen some people that think this main character is almost like a hashtag not like other girls because she doesn't want to be around other humans, and she's kind of quirky and eccentric and strange and a little weird. And I don't think it's one of those like manic pixie dream girl type of characters. And I don't think it's the like, whoopsie, I'm quirky because when we're dancing at this ball, I might step on your feet. It's not like that. She has a very traumatic past, and when you find out what it is, you're like, I understand why you don't know how to talk to other people, why you have basically no social skills, and it's very dark. Her past is, I don't want to spoil it, but you're like, oh, that's awful. And so I just don't want people thinking that it's the, like, oh, she's just weird or something. She went through something extremely traumatic. But I will say what I really loved about this story, one of the things I loved about it was the way that some of the other characters, in misreading how she expresses herself, later when you see characters start to have relationships with her, and when she starts to have relationships with other people, it was very heartwarming and wholesome, and you're like, oh, I don't want you to be all alone. I want you to have people care for you, and I want you to have friendships, and I really liked that aspect to it. It's very different from Margaret Rogerson's other two works. I'm discovering that she can write completely different stories from one book to the next, which I like, and then her other two works have been standalones. I think this one's going to get a sequel at some point, which I look forward to. And like I said, if we do get one, I will definitely be rereading this. Last on the list, we have Little Thieves. So 1, the cover, and 2, the synopsis, had me very intrigued. So this was on my list of anticipated releases, but it wasn't as anticipated as something like The Bone Shard Emperor or Cytonic. I really wasn't hearing a ton of other people talk about it. I saw a couple people here and there. And it is a Goose Girl retelling, which is a folklore story that I am not all that familiar with. But after I read it, I decided to look into the original story, and I really appreciated how different the author's approach was and what she did with the aspects of the original story. Either way, the author actually takes the kind of villain of the original story and makes that our main character. She is somebody who has lived a very difficult life. She decides to try and take the place of a princess using something that kind of glamours her to look like this princess. She decides to try to take this princess's place, rob all of the nobility who always mistreated her as this person without them realizing it, because as this person, she can get close to them, she can go to all the parties, she can go to all these different events. She wants to rob them blind and then run away and live her life happy and rich. And things don't exactly go according to plan. She has this curse placed on her, but she refuses to ask for her godmother's help. And she ends up having all sorts of different problems, not just with this curse, but also with people who are starting to catch on to her criminal activity. And on top of all of that, this princess was originally supposed to marry this awful man. And so then our character also has to worry about that. There's definitely always something that made me want to turn the page. I really liked our main character. I liked all the side characters. I liked the way that some of our characters defied the expectations of their usual character types. I thought it was a really good time. It is a standalone, so if you're looking for a good fall, winter standalone read, I would definitely say this one was a good one. It also taps into some aspects of class, the helplessness that living in poverty can present you with, how sometimes you're just born with a more difficult hand and how life is not kind to you, and sometimes that means you don't have the luxury of being kind back. And I think it taps into that really, really well. It just made me happy. It just made me happy. I had a good time with it, and I think more people should pick this one up. That's it for my November wrap-up. Let me know what you've been reading recently. I'll have purchase links for all of these in the description bar down below, as well as any reviews or other videos where I talk about them more in depth. Anyway, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. I hope you enjoy your December. We're basically already at the end of the year, and I'll see you all later. Bye.